Hi, this is Brennan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and I'm here with Pete Nelson, and we're going to do another episode of Metal Shop. So this is our heavy metal program. I was on last time with Jim, and Jim will be on again, but he isn't feeling very well today, so we're not going to have him on the program, and we'll talk with him next episode. And we'll probably divide this into two parts, because what I wanted to do is discuss basically the definition of heavy metal music, and I feel like it would be a good idea to get both Pete and Jim's viewpoints on this, because I feel like we're going to have a variety of opinions on the matter. And so for the first half, we're just going to talk about the Motley Crue movie The Dirt that's on Netflix, and then we'll get into the topic of heavy metal and how to define it. And just to give some background information, because people might not know who Pete is. Pete's somebody who is a member of one of my gaming groups, but he's also a guitar player, and he and I jam frequently. And over the course of our jamming sessions, it became apparent to me that Pete had more music theory knowledge than I did. So today, Pete's going to be the smartest person in the room when it comes to music theory. And you know, we'll see how good of a job we're able to do offering definitions and terms and parameters. So Pete, just to get it started, why don't you just give people a sense of what kind of heavy metal you tend to be into, and maybe what heavy metal era you grew up through, because I think you and I are of slightly different eras. I think I'm a little bit younger than you, so I might have got the tail end of some of the stuff that you were more deeply invested in.
Sure. That sounds great. Hey, well, thanks, first of all, Brendan, for having me on the podcast. Really appreciate it, and looking forward to having a great discussion. In terms of the types of metal that I like these days, I try to keep it pretty broad. I would say it's somewhere between looking at progressive metal, where there's a lot of different ingredients that go into the metal, and that can cover a wide area. I tend to I think the broader category for that is more extreme metal, where people are kind of testing the boundary of even what metal might be. So it might be super fast, or it might be super crazy vocals, or it could be strange rhythms, different instrumentation. So I think that's the category that I like right now, one way or another. So extreme metal kind of covers anywhere from some crazy death metal kind of stuff to progressive metal to what's called math metal. All that kind of stuff kind of falls in that category.
Could you describe math metal, just because I have a feeling that's one people might not have heard of? And Jim mentioned math in the last podcast, so I just kind of would like to highlight that one, if you don't mind.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think probably whoever came up with the term meant it to sort of make fun of the genre in a way, but it's highly complex rhythmically, I guess is what I would say. So the math part is, it's hard for us normal human beings to figure out how the drummer in the rhythm section just can keep up with the different time meters that they're playing in, and somehow they're able to keep it all straight, make it all work as a song, and it all works out great. And I think for me, the classic example of a band that sort of falls into that category sometimes would be Meshuggah. They have an amazing drummer. They're very rhythmically complex, and so sort of the term is, well, they must be doing math in their heads while they're playing music. And of course, some of that's probably partly true, but they also are able to sort of find the groove while keeping this very complex collection of rhythms and beats going at the same time.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that subgenre, but I have heard of it. And I've also encountered, I don't know what style of metal this is, or if it even is metal, but I've encountered guitarists who play like a really, it almost is like they're playing the piano on the guitar neck. Do you know what I mean? It's so insane what I see them doing. And and it seems metal derived, and it seems highly mathematical, but I don't know if it's a part of the math metal genre. What metal did you grow up with? What were your bands growing up?
Yeah, so growing up, I think I first started getting into metal with, basically what every other kid in the 80s started getting into. So in middle school, it would have been bands like Rat started coming out. That was a big one, where I had a good friend who, had all the T-shirts, and we played the tapes, and I started learning about, more hard rock, or what then was considered metal. So that's kind of an early memory that I have. And then that sort of got a little bit harder along the years. So that would be roughly the era 83, 84-ish kind of era. So, I knew of Van Halen, but I wasn't a big fan. 1984 was a little bit too early for me. I was kind of too young. I was probably more into Michael Jackson at that point than Van Halen. So interesting crossover there that he played on Michael Jackson's Thriller album. But
No, that's true. In fact, as a kid, I because Thriller came out in '83, right? Was that? Am I correct in that, or is it?
somewhere in there, yeah, I think so.
Because I was very young. I was born in '76, so I was like 8 when Thriller came out, and I was super into Thriller. And then I didn't get into metal until '89, probably. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
but I'm sorry. Go on.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And so that's kind of, just being a kid, you like what every other kind of music your friends like. But then in high school, another friend of mine was more into like punk rock and skate rock kind of music. So he liked the crossover bands they were started to call. So he introduced me to bands like Dirty Rotten Imbeciles and Stormtroopers of Death and Slayer and Megadeth and all that. So now I started hearing a little bit more of, the heavier types of metal. And even that was like, my eyes were open, but I wasn't necessarily a big fan of that kind of music just yet. But it was really fun to listen to with him because he was really into it. And it was just a good time to listen to that kind of music.
Okay.
So I think in the end, by the time I graduated high school, I was a Metallica fan. So that was the area where And Justice for All had come out. The Black Album wasn't out yet, but I really liked the Justice album, and that kind of led me to go backwards through the Metallica catalog and all the other stuff.
What was your opinion of the Black Album when it came out? Because that came up in last show as well.
At first, I liked Enter Sandman, and I couldn't listen to really the rest of the album. So, well, maybe I could get through Sad But True with that. So it was kind of like the 1-2 punch. I loved that, and then like, well, what happened here, and why did they do this to their music? So it was a little tough for me.
So that was too much of a deviation of their previous sound for you to enjoy.
Yeah,
and
yeah. It was kind of just more straight up like. I think so. As you can kind of tell, like when I talked about the types of music that I like now, I tend to like song structures that are a bit more complex. Like I don't like just verse, chorus, guitar solo in the middle, intro, outro kind of stuff. I want to hear some people kind of mix it up, show me some things that I haven't ever heard before. So Metallica had quite a bit of that. I felt like.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like all the way from like Ride the Lightning to Injustice for All, they were
right.
It was very unpredictable where they were going to go.
Exactly. So even then, that kind of appealed to me. And I think the good thing about the Black Album is that they started to strip out some of that complexity and tighten up the song structures, which I get is also a good thing. But yeah, it was just, for me, it was not expecting them to do that. In hindsight, I think it's a great album now. But at the time, I was like, this wasn't really the Metallica album that I thought I wanted.
Well, it's an interesting album to talk about because I got into that album... I got into Metallica just before that album came out because I was, like I said, like 89, 90 is when I started getting into this stuff. And so I got Injustice for All, I got Ride the Lightning, and then the Black Album came out. But I had in my head like what Metallica was before the Black Album. But I think because it was still, I was so just getting into them, I was maybe not as alarmed by the change as some of the older fans were. But also it seemed to me like it was definitely more of a hard rock shift and more of a pop shift in terms of song structure. But it felt like, well, this band that sort of carved out this sound, this seems like a reasonable direction for them to go through.
Right.
And when they went to Load is where I really couldn't make the jump with them.
Right.
But also I think there was a big cultural shift too because the Black Album was so massively successful. It was really weird seeing a lot of people that we wouldn't think of as Metallica fans embracing Metallica, and so I think there was a lot of other stuff going on culturally around it.
Right.
One thing so we're going to talk about the Dirt, but before we do, I wanted to ask you, we'll talk more deeply about the definition of heavy metal in a bit. Do you consider them a metal band, or do you consider them a hard rock band, or where do you classify Motley Crue?
Motley Crue, yeah, I think they're kind of a little bit on the border there, but I think for me, the way that I think about the song structures that I like and what makes metal for me, I think they're more on the hard rock end of things, especially towards the end of their kind of Dr. Feelgood era there. That doesn't feel like metal to me, but maybe in their earlier days, they were just more raw, aggressive, angry, wanted to be different. So I think that's the part that I appreciate as being a little bit more metal. So they maybe started metal and got less metal in my mind.
I would kind of agree. Like would you say Shout at the Devil is a metal album?
I think so. I think it's pretty close, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And so I think that's kind of their turning point there where they started to get a bit more mainstream and recognize that they could sell millions of albums and be really successful.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously, if you compare Motley Crue to Slayer, they're not metal, right? Like if you take like the more like the heavier and harder stuff that was really coming out, they're not metal. But I think if you compare them to like stuff like Iron Maiden or Judas Priest or things that were more rooted, like still had some of the rock sound present, I feel like Shout at the Devil kind of is close. It's still a bit poppy, I think. And it's funny because if you Shout at the Devil, I can sort of see as metal. Too Fast for Love, which came up before, I don't quite. It seems less metal than Shout at the Devil.
Yeah, and that's where I think like the interesting thing to talk about what's metal and what's not metal is it's kind of like life itself. There's no clear borders, even for bands sometimes, and that should actually be something that at least I try to appreciate if people are sort of stretching their boundaries. Like if they're just too much in the formula, eventually people are just going to lose interest.
Yeah, no, we'll get into that because that's a big topic, and I think that's one of the metal is populated by subgenres, and subgenres really have a tendency to die terrible deaths, right? Because they can get because they're locked in, right? Like I used to listen to doom metal, and it was I liked it at the time, and I still like to go back and listen to it, but sometimes like you go back and you listen to these subgenres, you're like, there was nowhere for them to really go from where they are, or it was so there were all these things that you had to do to be within this genre, and I can listen to like one or two albums of that, but do I really want 5 albums from a band that are all that thing?
Right.
So,
right.
So I think it's tricky, but getting into to The Dirt, which again is available on Netflix. It's based on the book The Dirt, Confessions of the World's Most Notorious Rock Band, which was written by Neil Strauss, and I think it was based on interviews of the bands. I've actually never read this book. I've always meant to, but it just sort of never happened. I don't know if you've read it, Pete, but
no, I haven't read it.
I used to, when I was younger in high school, I used to like to read all the biographies of Led Zeppelin and all the different, I like to read about the excesses of rock bands as a kid, and so I had the book. I think it was called Riders in the Storm, about the Doors and all that stuff. But it's that kind of book, and it's sort of like, I don't know. It's kind of like, would you say? Have you seen Bohemian Rhapsody, Pete?
Yes.
Would you say that this is sort of the poor man's version of Bohemian Rhapsody? Is that a fair comparison, or am I being?
Yeah, no, I think so. For me, I really actually enjoyed watching The Dirt. I thought it was a well-made movie for what it was trying to get across, and it for me, I think part of what Motley Crue's appeal was back then was, although they were popish, like everybody knew that they were pretty serious partiers, and sort of lived that whole rock and roll lifestyle. And so in a way, that's being very metal there too, is just throwing caution to the wind and not caring about what consequences were. But there were definitely really some sad moments in the movie as well that I didn't really know the full story behind.
Yeah, I want to talk about those in a bit, because I think that's sort of there's an interesting thing that goes on in this movie. But I'll say I enjoyed the film too. I definitely know it's not going to win any awards, right? Like it's not, or at least not going to win any literary sort of level. Well, I don't know. Like it's not going to be the favorite of critics. We'll put it that way, right? It's almost deliberately antagonizing the critic community, I feel, in the way that it's done. But I enjoyed it. I liked the way that they would do things where they would talk to the camera, and not just that, but they'd talk to the camera and they'd say, "This never happened." Do you know what I mean? Things like that I enjoyed. I thought that was I don't know, something kind of charming about that. That they were like, "This didn't happen, but we're going to keep it in because we like it," and stuff like that. But I thought that what the movie reminded me of in a really strange way was Goodfellas, and the reason
exactly.
Why, do you get why I'm saying that? Is that can you?
Yeah, go ahead. I think I do, but go ahead. Tell me what you're thinking.
So they start out in the first half of the movie. They present being in Motley Crue as this fantastically fun, over the top, just like you want to go and live in that world with them. Just like in Goodfellas, they make being in the mafia look exciting and sexy and dangerous. But then midway through the film in Goodfellas, Spider gets shot, right? And then that's when it's sort of like this descent into hell. It just and you start seeing all this hellish imagery in the background, like when they're digging the grave, and like there's the red sort of smoky atmosphere going on, and that's what happens in this movie at the crash where Razzle dies, right? They have the crash, and there's literal flames in the background, and then Nikki Sixx literally dies. You know what I mean? There's like it's sort of it becomes that descent into hell that you have in Goodfellas. And it just feels like it's structured similarly, where they lure you in and say, "Look at this tempting lifestyle that these rock stars are living," and then boom, it becomes tragic, and then they hit you with the double tragedy because they bring you with in the story of Vince Neil's daughter dying of cancer, and go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that exactly nails the structure for me. Is I didn't put it together with it being like the Goodfellas, but yeah, exactly. I think you nailed it.
And they bring in humor too. Like it's kind of a comedy for the first half, right? Like there's a lot of funny stuff. Whether the viewer laughs or not is up to them. But they're definitely going for humor, and they even have Tommy Davidson from Saturday Night Live in the movie. I honestly thought he was like the weakest link in the film, to be honest.
Yeah.
But he's there for humor, and I know why they put him there. And so by the time you get to the daughter dying of cancer, it's sort of set you up because you've been laughing the whole time. So by sort of being in that, I don't know, you just sort of let your guard down, and then it's like, oh my God, the guy's daughter's dying, and you're kind of more hit by it than you would have otherwise if it was serious the whole way through.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And meanwhile, Nikki Sixx is on heroin, still, and it's just, it really paints a picture of just, being disconnected. People who were such good friends early on, and nobody was really there for Vince, going through that kind of tragedy, it would seem like. So it was really tough to watch.
Well, and it was all stuff that you kind of were familiar with growing up. I feel like they all, like, they could have gone even deeper with some of the stuff, because I used to hear stories like they would shoot up alcohol into their veins and like really crazy things. So
yeah,
like that was the one that always amazed me, because I can understand, well, if you're a heroin addict, you have to shoot up the heroin into your veins. That makes sense. But why would you willingly inject alcohol into your vein? That seems enormously reckless, But,
And then, I wonder if that's one of those urban legends or not. Yeah, because I heard the same story, something like that as well, injecting who knows what.
I remember reading it in one of those like hard rock magazines, like Hit Parade or like, I don't know. There were you remember there were like a bunch of those magazines that all the bands would be in. I remember it was an interview, I think with Vince Neil. I can't remember. I remember them talking about the shooting alcohol into their veins and having a no condom policy. Which in the 80s was about as dangerous as you could get. But I mean, the movie definitely gives the impression, like you see a lot of the really dangerous stuff that they do, and the opening of the movie is it's pretty over the top the way the movie opens, I would say.
Definitely, yeah, I totally agree.
What did you think of the guy who played Ozzy? The scene with Ozzy where he snorts the ants, which is another famous story.
Yeah, I thought he played Ozzy really well. I totally bought into him being Ozzy Osbourne. So yep, and definitely that was also a story that you hear where I'm sure hearing it from both Motley Crue and Ozzy that it's a true story as well. So it was actually kind of cool to see that made it into the movie.
Yeah, because I remember that was a story you would hear about a lot in interviews and stuff. So it was. And it totally different than I am like that. Again, it's a movie, so maybe it's deviating from the reality, but that's not at all what I was picturing whenever I heard that story.
Right.
But it was entertaining, and that guy, he doesn't really like. I don't know. I don't think he's uglier than Ozzy. Like Ozzy is not as ugly as that man that was playing him in the movie.
Right.
I think.
Right.
But I feel like that kind of added to the charm of the scene, having him be that. I don't know, just off-putting as a person, No,
I totally agree. Like that was kind of like, Ozzy being at his extreme end of his behavior there too. And so having an actor who is, I agree, probably a bit less good looking than Ozzy Osbourne play him kind of emphasize that point. Like this is Ozzy's one of his lower points in life type of situation.
And he totally got like the posture and the mannerisms, and his physique was exactly correct. So it definitely worked.
It was perfect.
But was there anything about the movie you didn't like, or would you say you were a fan of everything in it?
I think I was pretty much a fan of just about everything in it. It was really entertaining, really funny at the beginning. It had some good ups and downs throughout the movie. So yeah, I liked it a lot.
The thing I didn't like about it was Tommy Davidson. I feel like his level of acting was not up to the level of all the people around him. And I watched the movie twice for this because I saw it first like a week or two ago, and I wanted to refresh before the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
My second time around, it really stuck out at me just how much of a discrepancy there was between his acting ability, and I forget who played the manager, but he had a lot of scenes with the manager, and
Right.
I was like, wow, this like Tommy Davidson is like a kid in a school play, and this guy is like doing real acting, and it just looks weird that he kind of comes in and just delivers these flat lines, and then everybody around, like, 'cause for the most part, I think with the exception of the guy who plays Tommy Lee, is like a rapper or something, right? It's like Machine Gun Kelly, I think, plays Tommy Lee. Let me make sure I got that right because I don't really know. Yeah, Machine Gun Kelly plays Tommy Lee in this. But with the exception of him, like, everybody's pretty much a real actor, right? And they were all
Right.
kind of doing the real actor thing. And so it just felt weird to see that, the contrast there.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, in the scenes where, and in Davidson, he played the record executive, right? I think it was.
Yeah, he
his
was the
role.
guy from Elektra Records who had the
Yeah.
green sweater.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree with your assessment there. Like, most of the scenes that he was in, I felt like you could probably almost do without, right?
Yeah.
Like, they weren't really compelling or all that interesting in a way. So yeah.
And when they first introduced him, I thought it worked because at first, I was like, well, he's this goofy guy, and it was humorous. But then by the second or the third one, you're just kind of like, well, it doesn't feel like he's. It just was not good enough acting. I felt for the level of acting that was going on around him.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair.
Yeah, but I did. So in terms of who I like the best, I think, and I don't even know if I can pronounce his name correctly. Ewan Rion, the guy who played Ramsay Bolton on Game of Thrones, he plays Mick Mars,
Right.
and I really liked him in that role. Number one, the whole time when they're doing this, like, I have a very clear image in my head of this is how they're going to do Nikki Sixx, this is how they're going to do Vince Neil, and for the most part, that's kind of how they did them. But I had no idea how they were going to do Mick Mars because he's kind of like a strange guy. You don't see that many interviews with him. Like, I mean, there are interviews with him. I've seen him in interviews, but I don't feel like I have as much of a handle on him as I do on the other members of the band. And so
Right.
I was very curious how they were going to do him. And so it was an interesting take on Mick Mars, I thought.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was a good choice of an actor there, especially if you've seen him in Game of Thrones. Like, you just associate, like, in Game of Thrones, he's way creepier, of course, than as playing Mick Mars. But Mick's got, like, he's sort of a strange dude, like you said.
Yeah.
But it was so a good choice as an actor if you can associate him that way, and just the way he delivered a lot of those one-liners, just the sarcasm and all that kind of stuff. You felt like you got to know him as a character too.
Yeah. And the guy that played Nikki Sixx, Douglas Booth, I thought he was really good. But he kept doing this thing with his lips where he was like, he looked like he was making an Angelina Jolie face. You know what I'm talking about? Like, yeah, that was kind of irritating me after, because I especially noticed it on the second viewing. I was like, I feel like he's doing that thing like where Angelina Jolie sort of does something with her lips, and sort of it just was. I started to find it off-putting.
Gotcha.
But I thought he did a really good job playing Nikki Sixx.
Absolutely, yeah, and it was an important role. I mean, he kind of was the lead character in a way, so it was good to have somebody play that role so well.
Yeah. So I mean, I enjoyed it. Again, it's not gonna it's not gonna impress the critics for sure, and I don't think it has. I think it's one of these films that's got like a really big discrepancy between the viewer rating and the so the audience score is 85% and the critic score is 40%. So it's one of those kind of movies,
Right.
Which is exactly the same thing that happened with Bohemian Rhapsody. So I think it's sort of cut in that same mold. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
In fact, I saw there was a really angry review of it in The Atlantic. I was just kind of skimming through some of the reviews, and this one was probably the most unforgiving review I've seen of the movie.
Oh wow.
But yeah, I think it's it's a Motley Crue movie. I'm not expecting anything beyond a certain level of entertainment. And
Right.
If I got some critical masterpiece, it would almost be insulting. Do you know what I mean?
Right,
In a way.
right.
um,
It should be entertaining, and I think it was. So
yeah.
yeah.
But yeah. So moving on from that, we're gonna begin our discussion of the definition of heavy metal, and this will be a two-part discussion because we really do need to get Jim's opinion, and we do need to get Pete's opinion, and we might even bring it. Like I know I've talked with Dion, and Dion actually is a fan of a lot of these bands too, so she might come in at one point and weigh in. We'll see how she feels about that. But
Cool.
but yeah. So Pete, why don't you give me your definition of heavy metal, and I guess I can give you mine, and then we can maybe try. And again, I want to say this is not an academic definition of the term. This is two metal fans who I think are, a little bit musically equipped. Like we at least have some level of understanding of how music works to discuss it. But we're not offering like an academic definition here. We're just trying to define what metal is for the purpose of the podcast.
Sure. Yeah, I've given it a little bit of thought. It's tough to nail down because there's so many different aspects that, and like you said, different subgenres of metal that are out there. So it could mean a lot of different things to different people. But I think what it means to me, there's kind of two main ingredients. One is I feel like there has to be sort of this element of darkness, I would call it. So that would either be, sadness, anger, fear, sort of like the dark side in Star Wars. Like there's some, it's not a happy genre. You're not gonna be partying to what I consider more the metal end of things. It's about that side of life where things aren't so great. I think that's a key ingredient for it. But I also feel like for it to really work for me, it needs to have something that really demands my attention. So it can't be like background music where it's just where it's just kind of playing and there's not a lot happening. So I like what are called different dynamics. Like I love songs where there's sort of a build up or some sort of payoff that goes on, or something interesting that starts the song, or there has to be something that gets my attention. It can't just be sort of just a straight playthrough of something that sounds the same the whole way through, for me anyway. So I think that lends itself to some sort of complexity, which might lead into some other topics. But for me, the basics would just be, it's got to be kind of about some sort of dark topic and dark sounding, but it's also got to be in some way something that grabs my attention and holds me.
Yeah, I thought about it too. And the first thing that I basically said the same thing you did for the first one, which is it has to have minor keys or minor chords have to be involved somehow, almost to the detriment of the music at times. Like I feel that in metal, the metal songs gravitate so much to the minor key that they will use minor chords when they maybe should even be using a major chord, just because you want that darkness to proliferate through the song. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So minor chords, minor keys. It's riff based. Metal is definitely riff based, right? Like I think that's the reason why, even though he's really important to the development of heavy metal, most people wouldn't think of Jimi Hendrix as a metal act, because he's more of a traditional guitarist in the way that he performs. Like he'll have riffs, but they won't be the spine of the song, right? He'll be playing more chord progressions once he gets to the sort of the actual song itself. There might be a riff intro, and so I feel like that's sort of like that Led Zeppelin style of riff music that you get is sort of important to metal. I think dark themes too, like not just in terms of the music, but in terms of the lyrics. And I feel that metal tends to have extremes of pacing. So like early metal tends to be very slow, you know what I mean? Like Black Sabbath type stuff. And later metal can kind of be all over the map, but it felt like it was an increase in tempo over time for a bit. And then I think extremes in general, like, so you have this sort of progression towards really, really fast tempos with like stuff like, like Iron Maiden style stuff. And then in thrash metal and Slayer, it gets even faster. And then you have extremes of volume, extremes of how heavy it can get. Like with death metal, it gets this really big, heavy sound that's almost obnoxious, right? And the vocals get so extreme that they're just guttural noise at a certain point, right? So So but then it's like metal hits that extreme, and then it kind of has to wind it back a little bit and find new ways to get extreme. So then, I feel like metal is one of these genres, because it moves towards extremes, has a tendency to hit these moments of crisis where they now have to discover something new, right? And so one of the things I wanted to ask you and Jim, because you and Jim both like progressive metal, and progressive metal, really, that's an example of an extreme, right? That's an example of taking a concept like music theory, right? Or a concept like pushing the boundaries and just pushing them as far as you can, right? And so, you hear progressive metal and you're like, oh my God, that's the most extreme implementation of music theory I've heard, right? That's
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you guys, has there been a crisis or crises in progressive metal because of that? Like, you must reach a certain breaking point where it's like, well, how many, how far can we push this concept, right, before it just snaps in half? Like, have they hit that point yet, or have they just found constant ways to innovate?
Yeah, I think for the bands that do it well, they are finding those ways to innovate. And so for me, I think the third ingredient, if you've got darkness and you've got some sort of complexity to your music, or something that gets people's attention, like you said, you're changing rhythms, you're changing the sound, you're changing vocals, anything to grab people's attention, you can be doing all of that. But if I don't feel like you've got, if the singer especially doesn't sound like they are really believing what they're singing about, it's about attitude in a way. If you're not delivering it with that sort of metal attitude, whatever is appropriate for that song, it definitely loses it. So I think you could be technically proficient, play all the right notes, but if I don't really feel like you've lived it or know anybody who's lived what you're singing about, I'm not that into it. Okay. So I think there's got to be that element of attitude in there too, is what I would call it.
Well, I wanted to get into this because what about like when it's pure fantasy, right? Like obviously you look at early Metallica albums, right? And they're singing about stuff they've never experienced before, but it's very extreme subject matter.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about it when they haven't lived it, but maybe there's the attitude behind it still somehow?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's how you sell it. There is with that attitude, like. So take, say, like a song like Creeping Death, for example, which is based on, the pharaohs and all that kind of stuff, and all this crazy stuff is kind of happening. But the reason that song is so great is you can be at a Metallica concert with everybody else, and there's a part in the song where everybody's chanting, die, 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 right? Like, that is just fun, and it's got attitude, and that's a part of it where it's not just fantasy, but you can it gets you into that song. So it's part of the attitude of it being delivered. But I do think that can be a danger point with some kinds of metal that is a little bit too fantastic that you can't relate to necessarily.
Yeah, no, I could say, I mean, I suppose it depends on, metal always, not always, but it often draws on, fantastic themes. So, I don't know at what point it becomes too fantastical for me. Like, I've always enjoyed Iron Maiden levels of fantasy. Sometimes when some of the black metal stuff gets a little too out there. Some of the, I forget what they call it, like the symphonic metal stuff gets a little bit too, like, there's a lifestyle behind this that I'm maybe not that into type thing. Like, I think it's sort of like some of it has like a Ren Fair vibe. Do you know what I mean? It gets a little too like, I'm fine with that stuff, but I don't want to go home and live out the Number of the Beast album in my living room, right?
Right,
you know what I mean?
Right.
And so some of those certain bands, you kind of get the impression that this is part of like a religious viewpoint or a cultural viewpoint that's really deeply part of who they are.
Right. Yeah, I think when it comes down to it, I think what for me makes the best metal these days is something that I would actually want to see in concert. I think metal, unlike maybe some other types of music, is something that you really want to be part of a crowd and be part of that energy. So that's where like having that whole attitude and delivery and belief in what they're singing about and playing about really comes across in the great kinds of music, I think, that can be done.
What do you think about metal today? Like, where would you say we are in terms of like, if metal is still a living, like, is it still a functional genre, or is it a museum piece? Do you know what I mean? Is it just an aesthetic that people can sort of imitate now, or is it still growing?
I think it is seems like it's definitely less popular than it was, say in the 80s, 90s there. But there's still definitely a really devoted fan base to metal. And I think, what appeals to me about it is that attitude that a lot of the bands that I like really just deliver their message and their thoughts and their music in a really creative way that gets my attention, makes me feel like they believe in what they're doing, even if it's highly technical, which I also like. I think that's really key. So the fact that there's still bands out there that are not playing the same old stuff that we've heard for 50 years, kind of a thing, keeps my attention there. So until people stop playing it, I think it's a living, breathing thing. There's still plenty of metal festivals that are out there. As long as they're going out and doing live concerts and people want to do that, I think it's got a chance. If we're all sitting at home on our computers or phones watching videos, then it's probably less of a thing. I think it's meant to be experienced as part of a crowd, and pump your fist, bang your head, slam into people, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I tend to be more into the older bands. Like, I tend to go back to the stuff I grew up on, or follow the bands that I grew up on to what they're doing now. Occasionally, I'll find, like, I found the band Chemist. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's I think Khemmis. But I thought they were great. They're sort of a newer doom metal band, but they were really doing some interesting stuff, and they have these great albums that they're not like 8 or 10 songs long. They're often like 5 songs, but it's just enough, and they just have this. It's a slow sound, but it's very melodic. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So, and I like the overall sound of the distorted guitar that they get. But I often have trouble finding newer bands. Do you know what I mean? I will listen to newer bands, but I don't click with them the same way that I click with stuff that I tended to grow up on. So
right.
So I'm maybe not as in tune with what's going on in metal these days as you or Jim maybe. But I do like. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking about how I get introduced to new bands these days. It's pretty much going to be through the internet, unless I happen to be at a festival and seeing things, which is another great way to do it. If you can go to a festival and in Tennessee, 2 or 3 or half a dozen bands, but there's 50 bands there, and you've got all day or multiple days there. That's a great way to be exposed and get the experience. That really teaches you a lot about what you like and who's out there that's still doing a great job. But then the internet's the other thing. So having YouTube give you related videos or anything like that, or reading comments about what other people might like, that's probably my key way to at least check out something else. Even if I don't like it, at least I can find things pretty easily these days.
No, that's true. And I should say, just because we're talking about, festivals and potentially local bands and stuff like that, the music at the start of the program is by a band called Distressor, which is a local Lynn band. And so, I heard about them through word of mouth. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But again, I'm not as plugged in as, like when I was younger, I would actively seek out a lot more music, go to the record store, buy the albums, all that stuff. There's something more ephemeral about finding it online, though. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if you have the same experience, but I maybe my brain is just not working the way it used to. But when I was a kid and I would go to the store, you'd get an album and it would stick in your head. Do you know what I mean? And now It's a lot easier for me to find an album and then forget about it an hour later.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that happens even if I own an album. There's so much music that's out there. I'll go back to it and I'll be like, I haven't listened to this in such a long time, and it was amazing, and it's still amazing. So yeah, it's just, there's more out there. But back as a kid with only a couple bucks in my pocket, I had to be very picky about which cassettes I was going to buy and play until they broke, kind of thing. So
well, no, that was the thing and again, I know this is sort of like maybe the old man part of the discussion, but there was a totally different experience going to the record store and getting an album than going online and surfing through YouTube. There's benefits to both. Like, there's definitely a value in finding music online because you can find so many different kinds of bands, and you can kind of get down this rabbit hole that you wouldn't really be able to go down. But there was an almost religious aspect to going into the record store when you were a kid. I mean, every record store was different, but I remember a lot of the ones around here were very dark. And you would go in, and it was like going into a cave, right? And you would find the album, and you would emerge with and the album, you would generally go by the cover. Like, you would have very little information to go on. You might hear from friends like about different bands. Like I heard about Iron Maiden from people that just talked about them in the posters. They were sort of well advertised. But then if you wanted to get more obscure bands, you really had to start taking chances and saying, "Oh, that album cover looks interesting." And you honestly never know what you were going to get. I got some great albums that way, and I got some awful albums that way. I was actually the kid that would bring the albums back when I didn't like them. And
wow, good for you.
Yeah. I used to do well. At one point, they told me to stop because I was doing it so much. But yeah, you would go by the cover. And if it was a good album, you would play the thing to death. Do you know what I mean? You would just play it constantly because you and also it wasn't like you very rarely would you be able to get the complete catalog of a band, right? Because you're a kid, you don't have all this money to burn. You can't just amass the whole Judas Priest collection and the whole Iron Maiden collection. You have to be very selective in what you buy, right? So
exactly.
That was another aspect. There were often gaps in your knowledge that it's one of the things that I find very interesting when I see younger fans online today. They seem to have a more complete sense of the history and knowledge simply because that information is out there. Whereas when we were looking, like I would get a band and I would listen to the album over and over again, and I would read the sleeve, and I would look at the liner notes where they talk about the bands that they're thanking and stuff, and then you'd find bands through those liner notes to go listen.
Sure, yeah, so, exactly.
But yeah, so I don't know. But I guess on the topic of whether metal is still viable, I feel like it doesn't feel like it's as an active or as maybe not active is not the right word. It doesn't feel like it's as significant a genre as it used to be. But maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I'm not plugged in, and I also feel like it's a genre that a lot of people will just sort of identify the aesthetics of and dip into, but won't necessarily be as deeply invested as the pioneers of the music were, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of like there's a much more widespread knowledge of music theory now than when we were kids. I think you can go online, you can learn about it, and I think that ability to sort of just identify the aesthetics of a genre is much easier for musicians to sort of wrap their head around. And I feel like that's happened with metal as well. Like you have a lot of channels where the concept of the channel is I'm going to metalize this song. Do you know what I mean? And I like channels like that sometimes, but sometimes I'll listen to them like like this is really chintzy. You know what I mean? Like this is something about this is very not metal at all. In fact, so yeah, I don't know, but yeah, so I guess so you would come down on the side of metal is alive. I would take it.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think there's a lot of bands that have been around for many years and even some new ones. So the fact that, you could go see an old favorite from 20 years ago or more and they're still touring is great. But there's plenty of new acts that are out that I'm pretty excited about too. So I think that's pretty viable.
Okay.
But I think it's also something that you kind of have to seek out. Like, and maybe it's just like you said, as we get older, it's not in our face as much. But when I was a kid, like everybody had their concert T-shirts, and you saw them everywhere that you looked. Maybe it's just because you're at the same age as everybody else, and that's what everybody was doing. But I would say if I went to the mall or went to a sports game or downtown somewhere, the chances of seeing really any concert T-shirt is rare. I think, not just for metal, but for anything really. So maybe it's just fashion's changing too.
Yeah, I mean it could be. I don't know. I feel like rock in general feels like it's on its way out. Do you know what I mean? Because like you said, there are still these bands out there. You could find them on the internet, but if you listen to the radio, you won't hear any of this stuff.
Right.
Unless you're listening to certain stations. Do you know what I mean? But like all of the rock stations in Boston are pretty much gone. We still get a couple, I think one from New Hampshire and stuff like that, but like the big rock stations that used to be here aren't around, and it doesn't feel like I ever hear new bands on the radio. If I listen to the radio, I'm more likely to hear like a classic rock station that's playing older music, which would include music that I would have thought of as new a few years ago, but is is now not new. So I don't know. I feel like rock is kind of like. I feel like rock is pretty much dead at this point. at least in terms of the culture. And I think you would have to include heavy metal in that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. But it's weird because it's not like it's gone. It's like you said, there's still these active bands. You can still find it. It's still out there. It's just not being consumed on a mass scale, I guess.
Right.
But it is a global phenomenon. Like, you do have, a lot of people throughout the world that listen to metal. So maybe that's sort of the thing that saves it, is that
right. Yeah, and I think for me personally, that's kind of what I'm looking for. Like, I want to be able to go to a concert and have a pumped up crowd, there to have a good time. And as long as that's still happening, I think that's all good.
So do you go to concerts regularly, or are you?
We try to. I mean, I would say probably maybe 4 times a year we might go, but sometimes we mix that in.
That's a lot for people our age. That's a lot.
Yeah. So sometimes we might mix that in. Instead of seeing a rock or metal concert, we'll go and see a comedian. But we try to get out every now and then. It's good to see some live entertainment of some kind.
I keep meaning to go. King Diamond came by a few years ago. I was like, I'm going to go see King Diamond. Didn't happen. Iron Maiden came by. I really regret not seeing Iron Maiden when they came by, but I'm very lazy when it comes to going out to shows. And also, I'd have to talk my wife into it and all this. So, I'm happy to sit through 2 or 3 hours of Iron Maiden. My wife doesn't even like to sit through Iron Maiden on the car ride home. So I think I think it would be a tough thing to convince her to do.
Yeah. But maybe if you and I could find the right concert, you and I could go together.
That would be ideal.
That works.
Like I said, I was really excited when I heard Iron Maiden was coming, and I was equally excited by King Diamond. But I think the last concert I went to was a Metallica. No, I went to Lollapalooza. I went to one of the Lollapaloozas.
Nice.
But yeah, and maybe I'll talk about that next episode. It was I don't know. It was like the late '90s. So it's been a long time, I would say.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Is there anything else you wanted to add about the definition of metal or the state of metal?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that the good news about it is that it's still out there, and there are all those different subgenres that are out there. And I like to dabble with different things, and I might listen to symphonic metal or power metal for a little while, but I kind of tend to come back to sort of the more aggressive types of sounds as what seems to suit me best, but not just straight ahead speed or shouting or screaming kind of stuff either. You
know what my issue with power metal is? I don't think it's metal. I feel like, and I hope I'm not insulting you when I say this, but and I'll tell you why. It's got way too many major keys. Do you know what I mean?
It's just a little bit too happy.
Yeah. It's got way too many major keys, and to me it's German folk music. It's not really metal. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's got all the trappings of metal. It's got the guitar. It's got the the drums. It's got the high pitched vocals, and it's got the distortion and all that stuff. But it's like you just took folk music and transferred it over to those trappings. So
right. No, I tend to agree. I mean, once in a while, I like to listen to it if I want to. Just my wife and I call them yo ho ho songs. Like you're just there, like yo ho ho, and that's what the song is. That can be great if you want to have that experience, but it's just a little bit too happy of a genre for me to really listen to for too long.
Yeah, I do have some trouble getting it. I mean, I there have been power metal bands that I've listened to and I've liked, but I feel a little conflicted about the genre in general. And again, I do think the minor thing is, and just so people know, I know we keep mentioning minor keys. This is the most unmetal thing in the world, but I have a ukulele in my lap, and so I just wanted to demonstrate for people that, that, I don't know if you can hear it, that is an A minor chord, and that is a C major chord. So that is you can hear how sad the A minor is compared to the happy C chord, and I should just say for the record, I can't stand the ukulele. I think it's an abominable instrument. But it's easy to hold in front of the computer. So I think we covered everything. I'm very interested to hear Jim's thoughts, because Jim had mentioned when he was talking about his definition of metal that it included math, and I've been intrigued by this idea from the very beginning of when he first mentioned it. but I don't think I quite understand exactly what he means. So I wanna explore that. You opened up some possibilities in your explanation, and so yeah. So I don't know, but again, you guys both come from more of a progressive metal wing of the genre. So, and I'm definitely not as familiar with that aspect of metal. So we'll be back on. We have the episode 1 up with me and Jim just kind of talking in general. And what we'll probably do is we'll have a third episode where Jim comes on and talks about the definition. And just as things go, we'll probably start focusing more on specific things in these programs. And maybe focusing on subgenres and stuff like that. We didn't even get into the history of metal, which would maybe be worth delving into. I guess we'll let you go, and until then, we'll talk to you later.